Hi, I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, remembering China's pro-democracy movement. How are the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre remembered amid heavy government censorship?
The topic is one of the most censored on China's internet. So what questions do you have about its history and legacy? Share your thoughts in our YouTube chat or via Twitter at AJStream.
This month marks 30 years since the start of student-led pro-democracy protests in China's Tiananmen Square, where weeks of peaceful demonstration later ended in a deadly military crackdown known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre or June the 4th incident. Hundreds and perhaps thousands are believed to have been killed by the People's Liberation Army.
The initial protests were sparked by the death of reform-minded former Communist Party head Hu Yaobang. In late April 1989, tens of thousands of students filled the square to mourn Hu's death and carry on his message of political change and an end to corruption. Students were later joined by civil servants and others calling for democratic reform. So today we'll speak to those who witnessed events at Tiananmen Square 30 years ago and look at how their history is being remembered on and offline.
In Taipei, Taiwan, we're joined by Wu'er Kaishi, a Chinese Uyghur dissident and student leader during the 1989 Tiananmen protests. In Toronto, Canada, Jan Wong, a journalist and author who was an eyewitness to the massacre at Tiananmen Square. And in Irvine, California, in the US, Amos To, a fellow at the UC Irvine School of Law. He studies free expression and online content regulation. It's good to have you all here, guests. Jan, I want to start with you. That atmosphere in April of 1989, think back, I mean, it's a long, long, long time ago. What was happening in terms of protests and demonstrations? What did it feel like to be a reporter in Beijing back then?
It was super exciting. And there was an air of optimism. It was springtime. And these were the first spontaneous demonstrations really since the founding of the People's Republic in the center of the country, in Beijing. And so the weather was beautiful, the students were out, and everybody was quite optimistic. Everyone thought this is going to be wonderful, things are going to change. And so there's a lot of excitement and lots of ordinary people joined in.
I want to show our audience Tiananmen Square, April the 22nd, 1989. So rolling back 30 years, there were protests, there were demonstrations. Have a look at this, have a listen to this.
还有一个办法就是咱们就是说组成那代表团重新去跟他谈判。再过2个小时，我们能动，我去跟他谈。
So what's happening here in Tiananmen Square is that people are gathering here to commemorate an official, a Chinese official who died called Hu Yaobang. He was really well known for his political and economic reforms. Have a look at the students in the square. Wu'er Kaishi, were you one of the students in the square right there?
Yes, that was me. The last image, the one in the green jacket. That I was one of the. I was in the middle of the movement from the very beginning to the very end, and in the very center of it. I was the founder of the hunger strike. I was founder of the Autonomous Students Union, and then I was there when finally had an opportunity to sit down with the government, which we hoped can be the major achievement of this movement, which is to force the government to sit down equally with the people, with the students. But then that meeting turned out to be. So I was right there. Mm-hmm.
And one of the iconic images from that time is this one that people are remembering online. If you do any search for Tiananmen Square on Twitter, you see images like this. This is a GIF. And this is a man who is commonly referred to now as Tank Man. This is a photo that was taken by an AP photographer, Jeff Widener. In the middle of that square, a man who stood in front of a tank. Jan, I know you were there this day. What do you remember about this incident?
This happened on a Monday. The massacre itself happened on a Saturday night into Sunday morning. And then there were still protests on Sunday. And then by Monday, because the soldiers kept shooting at people, by Monday morning, the streets were really dead quiet. And I was working in the hotel room overlooking that street. And my husband was with me, and he said, "You better get out here." And so I rushed out to the balcony, and I saw this, and I started to cry because I had seen so many people killed and wounded the day before. And then I thought, I can't cry because I have to witness this. I have to watch what happened. And so I watched, and when this happened, the streets were completely silent, and the lead tank tried to go around him. And then after a while, the driver of the lead tank turned off his engine. And so you didn't even hear anything. There wasn't any noise. And then the young man tried to climb up onto the gun turret, and they wouldn't open up the turret. The soldiers wouldn't open it up. So he climbed back down. And then I remember the tank started up the engine again, and the young man jumped in front again. And I was just sure he was going to die. But then suddenly, I think about two guys, maybe three guys from the sidelines, there was a small crowd on the side of the street. They ran in and grabbed him and dragged him off, and he melted away. And I don't think anyone really knows who he was or what happened to him.
Jan, I heard you describe this moment as a magical moment, and you described it as there being two heroes on that day, in that moment. Can you unpack that just a little bit more for us?
It took me a while because the world's attention was focused on Tank Man, the man who tried to stop. He had a simple shopping bag with him. Who knows who he was? But later it occurred to me that the second hero was the driver of that lead tank, because he stopped. He didn't run him over, and he just waited. And I'm sure he must have been punished, because this created this dramatic moment and this photo that went around the world, and it wasn't good for the Chinese authorities, and they knew who it was. So I think that driver of the lead tank is a real hero, and he's never really been recognized as that.
The pictures from June the 4th, 1989 were extraordinary pictures. Amos, I want you to look at them. I know you've seen them many times before, because bearing in mind that we have wu'er Kaishi, who was watching from a balcony, we had Jan, who was right there. I'm curious about what you wanted to ask Jan about these moments. Have a look first of all.
Sure.
Amos, what stands out for me is no weapons. No weapons,
right.
Fighting tanks. What did you want to ask Jan about that day?
So, Jen, bearing witness as a journalist to such violence and tragedy and acts of bravery and courage, how was that like?
Well, we were shocked. We didn't expect that level of violence. And when I say we, I mean the foreign correspondents based in Beijing. Most of us were China experts. We had devoted our careers to studying the language and studying the history. But we had no idea how to cover war. We didn't know what battlefield weapons were. And so we were just shocked and stunned. And I guess we had never dreamed that the China story would come to this. And I remember just wondering, what am I supposed to do? And what is that going through the sky? There was this red bullet, and I thought it was a flare. And later on, I realized it's a tracer bullet, which is what you use to measure your range if you're a gunner. But all these things I didn't know. But, you know, the Chinese people were equally naive and unready for the violence, because a lot of students were in the square and they held up their coats. They had coats even though it was June 4th, because at night it was chilly. So they had these big army coats and they would hold them up, assuming they were rubber bullets and that a coat would stop them. And so you can see later on, I went to the universities and I saw these coats, you know, displayed with all the blood over them. And I just remember being horrified, but also feeling like I have to be a journalist. I can't let myself fall apart. I have to take notes. And a lot of it, I simply felt, okay, let me time how long the gunfire is going on. Let me see what corner of the city is it coming from. And I felt pretty helpless and very upset and very angry at what was happening. Just shocked that people were being killed in front of me. But in a way, I was just like the Chinese people. They were shocked too. If you saw the pictures of how angry they were and how they're attacking a tank with their bare hands or at most a wooden stick. So it was. I felt very much in sync with all the people.
Right. And listening to that story from 30 years ago brings me to a couple of comments we're getting on YouTube right now live. This one is from Mahnur Singh, who says, does it still have the importance in the minds of young people in China under Xi Jinping? Another person, Bidet Patel, says, do Chinese know about the massacre? Their internet is highly censored. So Amos, I'll give this to you because particularly that last comment about the internet being highly censored, that's actually something you know very well about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's censorship infrastructure in China that's really constructed on the basis of technology-based restrictions, legal restrictions, as well as strategies of social control. And information about Tiananmen is blocked and policed very heavily. And one of the interesting things about these forms of censorship is that it's also imposed outside of China's territorial borders. WeChat, which is one of the most popular social media platforms, has about 100 million registered users outside of China. And so the censorship controls on information about Tiananmen also transfer outside to affect the Chinese diaspora.
It's one of the reasons that the China File, you can see them on my laptop here, this news site asked people to share their stories of Tiananmen. It was a call for personal stories, and our team translated one of the responses they got here from someone on Twitter who writes, in 1989, my father and his colleagues went to Beijing for a meeting, which was during the rise of the pro-democracy student movement. At the end of the meeting, he took the initiative to stay and witness history. Shanghai urged him to return, and he ignored it. In June, the tragedy took place and the country began to carry out mass arrests. My father's organization dismissed him, but secretly helped him get a student visa to Japan. Police eventually seized his hotel records, and when he returned to China, he was placed under house arrest for being mentally ill for a long time. So sharing that story on Twitter, because sharing it on Weibo or other sites in China, wouldn't necessarily be allowed because of the words in there, the keywords in there. Wu'er Kaishi, though, I'm hoping you can pick up on this story of sharing what happened 30 years ago for a generation that may not know the details of it.
Well, China, of course, have a strong censor of the whole wars. In fact, we have to invent terms like May 35th, to enforce. And then Tiananmen, the word Tiananmen will always be direct to somewhere else. It's in Chinese government's clear intention to wipe the story out from history. But still, every year when this days comes, there will be people try really hard to come around that censorship, and then to do something around the country. So I guess that gives you a kind of hope And then the people in China, not young people in China, they are not like our generation. They were brought up in the internet generation. When they process information, it's much more for individual expression, and then they want that. They want to keep that. They want to be able to do the selfies and everything. When they realize the whole China's information flow is like a major intranet. Like there's no Google, there is no Facebook, there is no Twitter, and then the only way you do it is we call it climbing the wall, which is a VPN and things like that. Then it has been declared illegal in China these days. So you can see the effort of the Chinese government trying to block information in China. And then without information, there is no environment for people to discuss, to debate, to exchange ideas. So sometimes you can feel very frustrated, and then you can almost feel like the Chinese students, Chinese young people these days, they don't care. But I believe searching for truth and searching for searching for idea, it's in our gene, and then there will always be people trying to learn about what happened these days.
Yeah, so I want to build on that because what one of the striking things is that what he just referenced, which is May 35, right, which is a term that's used to refer to the June 4th massacre, is now censored. Right? Any reference to it is censored on WeChat and also on other websites that are accessible in China. And I think the academic research actually demonstrates that for young users growing up in China in that kind of environment of censorship, even a field experiment was conducted where they were given tools to circumvent the censorship, and they did not really take advantage of those tools to access censored, politically sensitive information unless they were given some incentive to do so or being encouraged to do so. And so this goes to show that censorship controls in China really don't just stop information from reaching Chinese individuals, but it has also kind of created this culture of disengagement with politics and cultural and social issues.
So it's interesting that you say that, the disengagement, because of course there is a segment of society that is engaged and they are trying to get around the censors. I'll take a look here at my laptop. You can see a few of the Instagram posts of people who are trying to get around those blocks and using very creative ways. Here it's a pack of cigarettes to represent the tanks that I showed you earlier in that GIF. Another person shows the street where those tanks were, but it's empty, but it's still referencing that same time. And here's another one also posted on Instagram. This is 64 censored pics. But then in accordance with what you were saying, Amos, we got a video comment from someone. She's a reporter at The Verge in New York City. Her name is Shannon Liao. And she says that censorship is everywhere and your average person doesn't realize it. So here's what she told the stream.
As a result of that censorship, people are unable to comment on important social issues, like looking for, safe milk powder and vaccines for infants, protesting sexual harassment, and promoting feminism. Like these kinds of basic social issues are associated with political movements, and the government kind of stops it from happening from the first step just by censoring it, so that people can't, build a political mass or a group that could rise up against them.
So Jen, she says the point is to, I wanted to bring you in because she says the point is to stop a political mass. And I'm wondering, in the days after we saw such violence on the streets, what happened next? And is there a reason why we didn't see a stronger movement that actually was effectual?
Well, in the days right after the massacre, there was a real crackdown, and people were very frightened, and they were arresting people, and the evening news went on for several hours. It was usually just an hour, but it went on for several hours, and most of it showed people being rounded up. They had clearly been beaten up, and so it was kind of a terror, and people didn't feel at all free to do anything. I wanted to just go back to this internet censorship. And it's true that it's very hard within China, but I think we shouldn't forget that so many Chinese are studying overseas now. It's a huge trend in China. People are coming to Europe, to North America. At my university where I teach, we have lots of Chinese students. And the point I want to make is there's no incentive being given to them to check things out, but they're starting to wonder. And I think just being overseas this June 4th for the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, it's going to come up. And, you know, people are always interested in things that they're not supposed to look at. And because they know that they're not supposed to look at this, I suspect a lot of the Chinese students overseas, outside China, are going to freely look up the history of Tiananmen Square, find out what's happening. They're probably tuning into this show right now. And I think that will make a difference because many of them will go back to China and they will be influential because they will have had a Western education. They're at least middle class, if not richer. And they're going to be very important people in society. And I think that the experience of being in the West without a censored internet is going to make a big difference in China.
Jan, as you've been talking, I've just been looking up the Rolling Stone. They did a story 30 years ago about the children of Tiananmen Square. Wu'er Kaishi, you were one of the children. And now I would say that you were one of the fathers of Tiananmen Square right now. Look at that young face. You were part of that pro-democracy movement in China. Where is it right now?
Well, democracy, we fought for democracy, we fought for freedom, and then have been deprived from our freedom of being home, seeing my parents. So, but ironically, you can say that now we have been tossed into the world in one of those most free places. I lived in France, in the United States, and now in Taiwan, a new flagship of democracy. And of course, the contrast is then we can learn things about China. So we understand democracy and freedom much better, and then that make us feel even more, sad. You may even say about the direction it took the China from June 4th. Before June 4th massacre, before 1989 student movement, China in the whole 80s was moving to a more open or more freer environment. We were pressing the government to go faster in the same direction, which is opening up. But then it took a drastic turn into closing up. You can see the skyscrapers and the high-speed railway and all these things, and thinking this is a country that is opening up. But in the matter of fact, it is not. China is under close censorship for information, and then they have a very strong presence of state control, like police. They spend more money in the internal security than their national defense budget, which is already very scary. The national defense budget is scaring to the neighbors, neighboring countries. But then they spend more money in pressing the dissent within China. They actually have a term called it wu'er, maintaining stability. And they have a huge budget for that.
Wu'er Kaishi, thank you so much for sharing some of those remembrances.
Pleasure.
And Jan as well, and Amos for getting us up to date with what's happening on social and how young people in China and outside of China are thinking about the Tiananmen Square massacre. Thank you so much for being part of the program. We really appreciate it. But how's this conversation being unpacked online and being conducted online?
I think people are learning, and you can see the comments in YouTube with people who are seeing this for the first time.
Thank you very much for watching today's edition of The Stream. You can always find Malika and myself online at AJ Stream on Twitter. Take care.